I don't think you should be a day one adopter of the HTC Vive, Oculus Rift, or any other virtual reality headset, especially as it relates to gaming. The technology is an impressive fusion of display advancements, frame time pacing optimization, input latency management, and infrared scanning. Just the display tech alone is nearly unrivaled, with the Rift packing 2160 by 1200 pixels into a space smaller than a phone screen, and the Vive exceeding that resolution. But I don't think it's ready for the general gaming audience yet. It's impressive what can be achieved on these VR screens, though nothing has surmounted the challenges facing virtual reality, and those primary core challenges are hardware requirements that are excessively high, high cost, logistical and use case limitations, and a myopic understanding of game design as a whole. And that last point is the biggest one. There just isn't a good games ecosystem for VR right now, and we'll discuss that here. The Oculus Rift drew serious flack for its $600 price point announced during CES, which is almost double the initial $350 ballpark estimate that was stated for the headset back in the early days of development. We're still not sure what the HTC Vive will cost, but it will almost certainly be more than the Rift, especially with the addition of the two lighthouses for positional and spatial awareness of the headset. It does all that IR tracking to figure out where you are. That costs money. And we talked to Valve about a year ago now, and this was all unfinalized at the time. They were still targeting a December 2015 launch for the Vive, and we were told to expect something nearer to $1,000. Now, none of this was an officially stated number. It wasn't really set to be a final goal, but we can certainly expect the Vive to cost more than the Rift, which is already a lot at $600. Not unfair, mind you, not necessarily unfair anyway, but that doesn't make it affordable just because the price is fair, and it certainly doesn't make it a viable solution for gaming. The Rift pushes a 2160 by 1200 resolution. The Vive pushes an effective render resolution of 3024 by 1680, which is 1.5 million pixels more than 1440p on your standard desktop. And few video cards can even drive 1440p above 60 FPS, let alone the 90 FPS required by virtual reality headsets. NVIDIA recommends a GTX 970 or better, AMD recommends an R9 290, 390 or better, and we disagree with both of these bottom line recommendations. Both the Rift and the Vive demand a constant throughput of 90 FPS at high resolutions, with a heavy emphasis on stable frame times to avoid inducing nausea in the wearer. Latency has to be below 20 milliseconds, and neither the Vive nor the Rift presently support adaptive synchronization technologies, which certainly doesn't help in the delivery of that high, constant frame rate. Assassin's Creed sits at 65 FPS average in Syndicate using a 980 Ti at 1440 Ultra, which is again a lower pixel count than the Vive produces, although the Vive does some interesting trickery around the edges to lessen the sort of value of those peripheral pixels and improve the performance. But still, 65 FPS in Syndicate at 1440 Ultra, not great, and not good news for the support of VR. Fallout 4 was at 78 FPS average using a 980 Ti initial launch at 1440, and Fallout 4 is also uniquely unusable for VR since its FPS should not really be unlocked from 60, as that introduces a ton of physics issues. More of a problem with Fallout, but still, that is one more game off the list that is not inherently built for VR. To play anything resembling a modern AAA title is going to require a lot more than a GTX 970 or R9 390. To push 90 FPS at 3024 by 1680 on the Vive requires 457 megapixels of throughput per second. For the Rift, although lower resolution, we'd still need 233 megapixels of throughput, assuming the average game where we'd want, as an example, 60 FPS on a flat or curved panel display. Throughput demands are massively lowered, and tolerances for frame times are widened on these more standard displays. So there's a big emphasis on better frame times and more throughput. AAA titles require video cards that exceed the cost of the Rift just to run at the high minimum FPS for either of these two major VR devices, 90 FPS. And that's including the fact that we can't really count SLI or Crossfire, because neither has had persistently good frame times, even when their averages exceed single GPU solutions. And they've also got kind of still, even to this day, questionable day one launch support for certain games. Just Cause 3, a very good example of this. Assassin's Creed Syndicate, a very good example of lacking SLI and crossfire scaling. So those are sort of ruled out. And at this point, it just makes better sense to wait until superior hardware comes out before investing in these VR solutions. And with Pascal coming, with AMD's Polaris coming, it could be the case that VR is more viable on the new architectures and would make sense to at least wait and see how they perform, even if they're not really what we need just yet, even if they're still expensive, still $600, $650 just to play at the required 90 FPS frame rates. It is a good idea to wait until those come out and see what happens. But then there's the whole point of logistics too. Logistics is more poignant for the Vive than the Rift, and this photo shows one of our editors trying out a 30 or 40 pound virtual reality jetpack of sorts, which allows tether-free VR gaming by carrying around a 10-pound laptop with a 300 watt-hour battery accompaniment. And this is the only way to cut the tethers of VR. The cable is the biggest limitation to large-scale VR, since cable degradation over HDMI and latency concerns become seriously problematic. It's also just a jumbled mess of face-breaking potential waiting to happen, though that's really a lesser concern since you learn how to deal with that as you use the device, but it does restrict gameplay options. Before this, though, is the concern of having an empty room available just for VR. The Vive is best used in an empty room, and not many people have spare rooms lying around, especially in Asia and Europe and generally outside of places like the US where we have a lot of space. And temporarily rearranging just to play games isn't sustainable in the long run. Even assuming such a room exists in your house, the tether's intrinsic clumsiness limits movement to more caution steps, and don't think you'll be running around and ducking and diving even when comfortable, because there's a constant external awareness of the tether's location, and this absolutely kills immersion. The logistical challenge of room-scale VR kills its mechanical viability for games as we know them today. It is, in that respect, a novelty, but game design is another challenge to VR and could be reworked to bypass some of these limitations. A lot of traditional games don't make any sense for VR whatsoever. First-person shooters, for example, are sort of right out, as is anything else that's even moderately competitive, because that instant ego check just isn't worth trying to overcome when you're competing against people who are using more standard input or display devices. It's just not possible to beat someone flicking their wrist with a mouse when you're using head movement tracking and all of this advanced technology and demanding high frame rates and things like that. It's not going to be a winnable scenario for the VR user. But VR was never meant for FPS or competitive games. Gaming has evolved to consist of three constants: a stationary player, an input device, and a flat display. The Rift is meant to improve upon traditional gaming by adding full spatial awareness and head look, enabling the player to easily isolate head and body movements for better survey of the environment. A joystick or other device will still be required for about face or 180-degree turns, but free look means that we can glance around that 180 degrees, roughly anyway, of terrain in front of us by physical head movement within the field of view restrictions of each respective headset. Games that are fun because of their mechanics are challenged by the Rift and the Vive. The best use case is for cockpit-oriented games like Elite, Eve, and Star Citizen, but that's an awfully specific gaming scenario. These work well because we're seated in-game and in life, and there's actually a functional gain from being able to head look out of the cockpit window while managing the controls separately. As for the room-scale VR with the Vive, that's a completely different challenge. The Vive's biggest challenge, and this is true for the Rift too, but to a lesser degree, is a myopic understanding of game design. The Vive needs new types of games to be created to truly use the physical movement to its fullest potential, and I'm not talking about more of that experience bullshit either. I don't want to put any developers down, but wandering around Everest isn't fun, and neither is walking around the bow of a sunken ship and looking at whales. It's cool for one demo. It is technologically staggering. The graphics technology, the photos that go into these things, it's very impressive, and it's mind-blowing how much technology has gone into these demos and experiences. But they're not fun, they're just cool, and after that first time, the charm is gone. They're not games. There's no mechanical depth, there's nothing to propel that high created by a proper game's ever-present sense of player self-betterment, or of exploration, or of learning how to get better at the game. It's entirely observational, and this FPX stuff, first-person experience, and the notion that walking around a virtual landscape recreating some real or non-real or inaccessible world would be fun is just naive. After initial onset, after that first experience, it becomes a novelty, it becomes a hassle to set up, to experience. It's something that you show your dinner guests when they come over. It's not a game. It's not something you sit down for at the end of a day and play for fun to relax. It's something that you have to go through effort to set up and put on, and once you've done it, you've done it. There need to be new types of games for this type of VR, and just redeploying what already exists isn't going to work. It's not going to cut it this time around. VR's tried a lot before, and this time it is technologically, financially, in terms of respect in the industry, the mainstream, it is here to stay. VR is very real, has a firm grasp on a foothold in the industry, but it's really got to execute with the developers. There have to be the right games, the right new moves away from what exists in order to really leverage that new type of exploration, that room scale service. And on the side of the Rift or even the Vive, if you're just seated and playing, there's still problems because yes, it works very well in cockpit simulators. It can even work in racers, though I don't really personally think I would want to use that as someone who plays a lot of racing games. But for competitive games, for first-person shooters, for anything that is very heavily invested in the mechanical and the skill set of the player, you're suddenly challenging your own ego by trying to learn this new way of playing. And if there's an online element, it's just damaging to your ability to compete. So, but that's not really a thing that people, I think, who are pre-ordering this stuff are worried about. They're probably worried about RPGs and Star Citizen, Elite Dangerous, Eve. Even on that side, the space sims aside, because I do agree that those are fantastic use cases for this technology. Even outside of RPGs, you're still seated playing, you're still holding a controller, and you've got this sort of this area that you can see and look around with head look, but you've still got to move a joystick to turn around and look that way. And it just feels very sort of haphazardly thrown together right now, which is not to speak down to the VR technology, because again, it's impressive. But in terms of mechanics, it's just not there yet. The games need to catch up. They need to really support this stuff before it's worth buying. And in an industry where desktops with monitors are obviously the dominating force, that's going to take a while because these developers, these publishers, they're in it to make money. They can't make games if they're not making money. Or well, they can, but they won't last very long. So it's going to be a little while before this stuff really gets pushed into the mainstream, and that requires some patience, and that is why I am so heavily in favor of waiting. Ultimately, at our site, at the channel, Gamers Nexus, we work pretty hard to protect consumers from things that are maybe unethical or, in the very least, hype trains. And VR is a hype train. It is a bit out of control at this point. And my advice to you as a consumer is to distance yourself a little bit, sit back, let the first wave hit for the Rift, for the Vive, whatever you're interested in, and observe and read the reviews. We're going to have one, even though I'm saying don't buy one. It is our job to research these things, to analyze them, benchmark them. So we will have these devices at some point anyway. And whether or not you get the info from us, just read some reviews, read user comments, and then wait to see how the development community responds and starts putting out games to leverage each of the headset's respective advantages. So I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to say here. I just want to make sure everyone's protected from the runaway hype train. I'm not trying to diss on VR. Again, I've said this, I need to say it again, it is seriously impressive, but also every time we're doing these demos, they're experiences for the room scale stuff, and experiences do get boring, so there needs to be more than that. There's some stuff like, there's a zombie shooter for the Vive. I've tried all of the demos, and even the zombie shooter is just a king of the hill. That's kind of what they all boil down to. It's a king of the hill because you've only got a 12 by 12 room you can walk around in, so at some point you're hitting a wall, and that limits your exploration abilities, and that's why I'm saying there need to be new types of games for the Vive. For the Rift, it's just all these other potential things where it kind of feels disjointed. You've got a controller, you're sitting in front of a monitor, but you have another monitor strapped to your face, and there can be a better solution, or at least better development, and it will happen in the semi-near future. But the biggest point is just wait for better hardware, because it's kind of hard to run this stuff anyway, at least at good graphics quality. So that's all for this video. As always, if you like our type of coverage and dedication to this sort of consumer advice, hit the Patreon link in the post-roll video, help us out directly. And you can read a lot more on this topic on the website, gamersnexus.net, where I've got a full opinion piece written out, completely documented for your purvey, and so you can decide if you agree with us or not. And that is all for this time. I will see you all next time.